The first of two very impactful flyweight main events for the UFC has come and gone as we saw Manel Kape versus Asu Almabayev kick off the month of March at UFC Vegas 103, and the second still to come is the final event of March of 2025, which will be between Brandon Moreno and Steve Erceg in Mexico City, Mexico. But on this night, at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, Nevada, Manel Kape comes out victorious. He has now won 6 of his last 7 fights, and he's on the heels of 2 very convincing back-to-back finish victories. On this night, it was against Asu Almabayev, in which he ended a near 8-year, 17-fight winning streak. The 31-year-old star boy, right in his prime, has now finished 18 of his 21 professional victories, and he does it here against Asu Almabayev, who was surging, who was dangerous, and who was entering this fight on short notice, replacing former title challenger Brandon Royval due to injury. It was pretty simple to project how this fight would have gone, because if Manel Kape wasn't able to fend off the takedowns and get up should he get taken down against Almabayev, it could have turned into a long night and a very successful night for Asu. However, the fight played out as the second option, which was Manel Kape being able to fend off the 2 or 3 takedowns that were attempted by Almabayev, keep the fight standing, and pick Asu apart up until the finishing sequence around the middle of round number 3, 2 minutes and 16 seconds in, with a TKO up against the fence. Unfortunately, there is a tad bit of controversy surrounding this main event, nowhere near as much as there was for the UFC Seattle main event last weekend, but it's still a talking point to discuss here today, and that was some eye pokes paired with maybe a little bit of an early stoppage. Manel Kape was pouring it on up against the fence with a lot of striking combinations, a lot of output that was not being answered by Asu and wasn't necessarily being defended all the best as well. A lot of shots were finding their mark, and while he didn't put Asu down or unconscious, it wasn't the most egregious stoppage I've ever seen, and Mike Beltran was the referee here that had to be a part of this main event. But I will say that there was an eye poke earlier in the fight that had the fight halted so that Asu could regain his vision, right? Wipe out the eye, all the things we're used to seeing in these fights. But then another eye poke or 2 potentially even happened leading into the finishing sequence in this third round, which does cloud it a little bit. Especially when you see the replay slowed down, where you can see Manel Kape outstretching his fingers not once, not twice, but potentially even leading into a third time, and I'll try and find the footage to feature here on the episode. I'm not saying that he was doing it intentionally, but it was a very bad look to just be pawing at the face of Asu Almabayev, whether he was trying to land a slap or not, like we had seen Chepe Mariscal land earlier on in the evening. Beltran was not really able to see these particular eye pokes, and Manel Kape went in for the kill before anything could be done. And before that finishing sequence, there was even a moment where Asu tried to get the fight halted, but Beltran didn't see the eye poke, therefore it continued into what we would see being the finish. So I would like to know your thoughts on these eye pokes. Were they as egregious as it looked, especially when slowed down? Should Manel Kape have been deducted points after the first eye poke? I know that leads back into the discussion last week with Song Yudong versus Henry Cejudo. Should Jason Herzog had deducted points out of Song Yudong, which would have extremely altered the fight because it ended in a technical decision, and had a point been deducted, it would have been a draw instead. But eye poke aside, stoppage aside, it was a very good performance from Manel Kape, and he does ultimately get a TKO victory, his second in a row, both of them in the third round. Prior to this, it was against Bruno Silva back in December. And all in all, he now finds himself having won 6 of his last 7 bouts, and in the post-fight show, they had him go face-to-face virtually with the champion Alexandre Pantoja, so it seems as though all signs are pointing toward Manel Kape versus Alexandre Pantoja Part 2, this time with gold on the line. But is that the next fight, or is it going to be KKF, Kai Kara France, who is coming off of a huge finish over former title challenger Steve Erceg? It seems to be very up in the air. This fight was all but promoted as a #1 contender fight, especially for Manel Kape had he been the winner, and obviously in the aftermath, he finds himself as the winner. He finds himself talking to John Anik in the octagon post-fight as if he is the #1 contender. He finds himself on the post-fight show talking to the champion Pantoja as if he is the #1 contender. So I want to hear from you all. Is he the #1 contender for Pantoja's throne? And while winning 6 of his last 7 fights is very impressive, I do think it's worth pointing out that the resume that Kape has put together so far isn't the craziest of resumes that we've seen. Yes, there's way more green than red. He has a lot of big finishes, a lot of flashy performances in there. But it's worth noting that in the 3 biggest fights that he's had, he has lost. Albeit his debut was against Pantoja, who has gone on to solidify himself as, in my opinion, the 2nd best flyweight of all time. His 2nd fight was against a perennial top 15 guy in Matheus Nicolau, and that was a razor-close split decision, and his other loss was to still undefeated Muhammad Mokaev in a very competitive decision last year as well. But that is worth keeping in mind that in the biggest opportunities, in the biggest fights, Manel Kape has lost. However, this was supposed to be a huge opportunity for Kape to take on Brandon Royval, and obviously we don't know what would have happened because the fight fell through. So I will say that if they decide to go the KKF route and do him versus Pantoja, I would like to see Manel Kape versus Brandon Royval be rebooked as a legitimate #1 contender fight in the meantime. Are you all opposed to that idea, or do you think if the UFC decides to go Haqparast versus Pantoja, that Manel Kape can just sit and get the winner of that fight? I think it would be an opportunity for Manel Kape to get a true big win, because outside of this one against Asu Almabayev, who was short notice and #8, his only other ranked win was, I believe, David Dvorak back in 2022. So give me your thoughts on the current flyweight championship scenarios. What do you think should be next for Pantoja? What should be next for Manel Kape? And is Haqparast still in the mix? And now that we are done with the main event discussion, let's jump into some of the other notable results from the card. And it starts in the co-main event of the evening, a fight that didn't leave the first round, as many of us anticipated being the case. And that is where we saw Cody Brundage get a stoppage with just 15 seconds remaining in the first round against Julian, the Cuban Missile Crisis Marquez. That is now Marquez's 4th consecutive KO/TKO loss, and more than likely his last opportunity in the UFC. But on a brighter note, this was a massive victory for Cody Brundage, who is coming off of a no contest due to illegal elbows with Abdulrazak Al Hassan, and prior to that, a loss to Bo Nickel. He's 30 years old, in his prime, has now finished 9 of his 11 fights, and this one here against Julian Marquez was quite literally rock'em sock'em robots. But there is a tad bit of controversy in this co-main event as well, and that is mouthguard gate. We saw in this fight, in this first round, where these two were swinging and banging up against the fence, where both of them had lost their mouthpieces and continued to just go to war, and Mark Smith, the referee, decided to step in to give them both their mouthpieces, but not at a point in time where we would typically see. He instead chose to do it right in the middle of an opportunity for Julian Marquez to continue pouring on shots against Cody Brundage up against the fence. This was a very questionable decision, and immediately after the stoppage was over, the mouthpieces were in, that is when Brundage began his own finishing sequence. So a very gray area here, and what was an absolute banger of a fight for 4 minutes and 45 seconds. But did you think this was the right decision for Mark Smith? Did he choose the right time to do the mouth guards, being that there was momentum seemingly on the side of Marquez, who inevitably would go on to now lose the fight? Then we saw back-to-back Fight of the Year contenders on this UFC Vegas 103 card. Yes, of course, it's just March 1st, but these are the two clear-cut runaway #1s right now. First, it was Nasrat Haqparast, Kelvin Gastelum's twin brother, who, is no stranger to a Fight of the Year contender, and he took on and took out Esteban Ribovics via split decision in a fight that was a back-and-forth 15-minute kickboxing war. And for Ribovics, he's no stranger to a Fight of the Year contender, because in 2024 at Noche UFC, he was one of the best fights of the year against Daniel Zellhuber, where he got the victory via decision. And Nasrat Haqparast sneakily finds himself on a 5-fight win streak now in the lightweight division. He's only 29 years old, so just now hitting his stride, hitting his prime, 18-5 overall, and hasn't lost a fight since February of 2022, over 3 years ago, and that was against King Green, Bobby Green, formerly known as, and prior to that, it was against Dan Hooker. I think it's safe to say that after a victory like this against a surging prospect in Ribovics, paired with 4 additional victories leading into this one, it's got to be ranked fighter or bust next for Nasrat Haqparast. He has earned that opportunity. And the other Fight of the Year nominee is between the still undefeated Hyder Amil and William Gomis. Gomis was 4-0 in the UFC leading into this fight. Hyder Amil was 10-0, and they went toe-to-toe as well for 15 minutes. This one had a little bit more grappling intermixed, but it was all in all still a lot of shots being traded back and forth, and it was another split decision, just like Ribovics versus Haqparast was. But the 34-year-old Amil did enough to get the victory on the scorecards, 11-0, 7 finishes, and this was an absolute blood and guts war where someone just had to prove who had more will, who had more dog, who had more gas in the tank, and that went toward the Tasmanian Devil, the Hurricane, Hyder Amil, 11-0, 3-0 in the UFC, a Dana White Contender Series alum, and potentially a player in this featherweight division. We saw another undefeated fighter on the card right before Hyder Amil in Danny Barlow. However, he would not be as successful as Sam Patterson would become the first man to ever grant Barlow a defeat in his professional career, and he did it with a first-round TKO stoppage. The 2022 Contender Series alum Sam Patterson has looked incredible since dropping his UFC debut to Johan Lanessi in March of 2023, and is now finds himself on a 3-fight win streak, a 3-fight finish streak. The 6'4", 28-year-old welterweight is 13-2 overall with a draw and has finished 12 of his 13 victories. He is a kill or be killed fighter, but very technical, just finds himself into these firefights at one point in the fight or another. Most of the time, it's in the first round. This was a massive victory for the future out of England, and maybe if he gets 1 or 2 more wins, we're talking a welterweight top 15 opponent next. Mario Pinto knocked out the former Jacksonville Jaguar, Austen in the second round in the shot heard round the world.
Oh my gosh, just laid him out. Pinto! Whoa!
The 2024 Contender Series alum turned UFC newcomer made good on his debut with a vicious one-punch knockout over Austen Lane. He is now 10-0 with 7 finishes. 6 of those are by knockout. He's only 26 years old. Pinto is definitely someone to keep our eyes on as we move into the latter months of 2025, and by the time 2026 rolls around, he could have a number 15 or lower ranking next to his name. Chepe Mariscal continues to outdog every single opponent that steps foot in the octagon with him, and he does it here again against Ricardo Ramos via unanimous decision. He now finds himself on an 8-fight win streak, 5-0 in the UFC, and he is 18-6 overall, 32 years old in his prime. Chepe Mariscal is must-watch television. He has a gas tank that is endless. He does not let his opponents get the better of him, and it shows here, being that he hasn't lost a fight in nearly 5 years, dating back to September of 2020. 8 wins in a row, 5 in a row in the UFC. Surely a ranked featherweight is next for Chepe. Let's take a look at the back half of the division real quick. Number 15 is Dan Ige. Number 14 is Calvin Kattar. We know Dan Ige is currently booked up at the moment. Does Calvin Kattar take on another prospect like he just did against Yusuf Zalal? I doubt that, but maybe we could even get Chepe Mariscal versus Hyder Amil. They competed on the very same night. Winner gets a top 15 opponent next. The Tasmanian Devil, the Hurricane, versus the Machine Gun Chepe Mariscal. That's a blood and guts banger if I've ever seen one at 145 pounds. And last but not least, Ramazan Temirov kicked off the night with a victory over the 12th ranked flyweight in the world, Charles Johnson, in a very fun 15-minute fight. Temirov is just 28 years old, but is 19-3. He's finished 12 of those, 11 by knockout. He's 2-0 in the UFC. He's a rising veteran. And his first fight was a knockout against CJ Vergara, so it was only right that he got a ranked opportunity after a big win like that in a debut. And now he gets the decision over the seasoned veteran and surging Charles Johnson, who had won 4 fights in a row in his own right coming into this one. Temirov hasn't lost a fight since September of 2019 and is now on an 11-fight win streak, none bigger than this one over CJ, that catapults him into the rankings. What could be next for Temirov? Well, to be quite honest with you, I think it would be a great opportunity to pair him up with Asu Almabayev, who lost in the main event but is currently number 8 in the world in this flyweight division. Why not have them clash against one another? They're on the same timetable already, being that they fought on the same night. Sometimes fight matchups just make too much sense to me, but will it make sense in the war room come Tuesday morning for Dana White and the fellas? So that is it for UFC Vegas 103. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Sound off on the main event. What did you make of Manel Kape's performance, of the stoppage, of the eye pokes, and everything in between? What is happening in the flyweight title picture for the champion Pantoja, for Kai France, and for Manel Kape? Give me your biggest takeaways throughout the remainder of the card, as well your predictions on what could be next for some of the big winners. If you enjoyed this recap, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, where every single week I recap the most meaningful results from every card. Heading into each weekend, I break down and preview the biggest fights and all the best storylines and what is at stake, and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Friday and Monday podcast episodes release there. Have a great week, and I will see you in the next video.